Chapter 27 of A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron White. A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science by George Griffith. Chapter 27. On the third morning after the momentous interview at Hyde Park Court, Grace Enstone, running through the little pile of letters which lay at her right hand at the breakfast table, opened an envelope which had a coronet and a monogram on it, took out 2 exquisitely designed cards, glanced at one of them, and said, tossing it across to her husband, "There, Harold, what do you think of that? The gossips were right after all, don't you see? But what if your suspicions about him are all right, and the poor princess were to find it out too late? To wake up some fine morning and find that she had married such a man as Collier Banfield was. Don't you think—" "No, dear, I don't," he replied somewhat coldly. "I know what you are going to say. Don't I think she ought to be warned before she takes the fatal step? Certainly not. It is no business of ours to interfere with the matrimonial projects of an experienced woman of the world like the Princess Natif. If she chooses to marry without inquiring into his antecedents, what on earth has that to do with us? Besides, you know, I am not absolutely certain, and if we said anything of that sort before I am, a man like Siemens could make things very unpleasant for me, and would. No, I think Her Highness will have to stand the hazard of her luck. She is not exactly the sort of woman I like, in spite of her undeniable beauty and brilliance, but for all that I should be really sorry if she marries Siemens and he turns out to be Banfield." "Yes, poor thing," said Grace. "That would be a fate for a woman who is received at all the courts of Europe, in spite of all his millions." "Which would not be very much use to him socially or financially if our friends from America are able to help me to prove him to be what I think he is, princess or no princess. I'll have no mercy for him. But for the present, at any rate, I suppose we must give him the benefit of the doubt, and therefore I suppose you will attend the reception at the Institute." "Oh, yes, of course," she replied with a laugh. "All the disciples of the new craze will be sure to be there, and considering the princess's position and Mr. Siemens' enormous wealth and influence, I should think all the upper half of society will be there as well. It will be quite one of the picturesque functions of the season. But what about you? I'm afraid you won't be able to go." "Oh, no," he said. "That is quite out of the question. I absolutely must start for Enstone tomorrow. I put that business off quite long enough, and, after all, ironworks and collieries are a little bit more important than the wedding reception of one's friends who may shortly become one's enemies. Still, that won't matter to you, dear. You can easily fix up a party with Lady Georgina and Mrs. Grover, and of course the gallant Colonel will be only too delighted to escort you. Don't you worry about me. I shall be much happier fighting for my own way with those hard-headed northern coal and iron kings than I should be loitering about the grounds at the Institute, and paying more or less insincere compliments to Her Highness Mrs. Headley Siemens. Rather curious mixture of titles, isn't it? It would be still more curious, I'm afraid, if she found herself Her Highness Mrs. Collier Banfield. But for her sake, I think we may hope that she hasn't anything like that in store for her. But isn't it just like her, springing the news of her marriage on the world like this at a couple of days' notice, and selecting the Institute for her reception? I rather wonder the grave and reverend Isa Ramel gave the use of his sanctuary for such a frivolous purpose as a wedding reception. But they are, of course, both disciples, and, I dare say, very considerable contributors to the funds, unless poor Sir Godfrey's million has made them independent of that sort of thing. Well, from what I hear of their operation in other parts of the world, I should imagine there wasn't much of that million left," replied Harold. "And without any undue prejudice, it is a jolly good job that your late lamented uncle isn't still in the position to devote more millions to the object which Isa Ramel and the rest of them had apart. Now, dear, I must be off. I suppose your most immediate concern now is something dazzling in the way of costumes for the function." "Of course," she replied with a laugh. "What else do you suppose a woman would be thinking about under the circumstances? I shall have the Victoria at once and go and see Lady Georgina and Mrs. Grover, if I can catch them before they go out, and have a good talk, and then we'll go and enjoy ourselves in Dressland." "Right you are, dear," he said, going round the table and taking her by the shoulders. "Good morning. You go and spend the money on fineries, and I'll go and see if I can make a few pounds to repair the damage." "A few pounds?" she laughed when she had returned his kiss. "I am afraid it will come to rather more than that, you mercenary person. But after all, it won't make a very big hole in those thousands of thousands that you keep on piling so recklessly on top of each other. Now get away to your old money-making. I must go and see Harold II, and then dream about dresses." The Princess Natif's wedding reception at the Institute of Psychic Science was, as Grace Enstone had so innocently anticipated, a very brilliant, in fact a triumphal, success. The wedding ceremony had been performed quite quietly at St. Luke's, Kensington, under a special license. The invited guests had not numbered more than a dozen, and the bride, who had no near relatives in England, was given away by the Russian ambassador, an old friend of her father's who acted in loco parentis. With an instinctive genius, or stage effect, and for other purposes of her own and her husband's, the princess had concentrated all her efforts on the reception, and the result had amply justified even her most sanguine anticipations. Every one from east and west complimented her at the leave-taking on having organized and achieved the most brilliant matrimonial function that London had so far seen. But the real achievement for which the function had been organized had not yet been accomplished. It was a difficult, and, as some might have thought, practically impossible task to spirit such a well-known woman as Mrs. Harold Enstone out of London in the full swing of the season, and to cause her thenceforth to vanish from the world which knew her so well. And this had to be done if the unholy marriage compact was to be kept, and this carefully arranged opportunity could never be repeated. Her husband's absence had in one sense confused the plans of the conspirators, but in another had simplified them. When Grace came with Lady Georgina and Mrs. Rowell Grover to say good-bye and offer their final congratulations, the princess slipped her arm through hers and drew her aside, towards the door of the big reception-room. "My dear Mrs. Enstone," she said, in a voice in which Grace immediately recognized a note of apprehension, "I want you to do me a very great favour. Will you?" "Of course, if I can," replied Grace. "Under the circumstances it would be difficult to say no, wouldn't it, even if one wanted to, which I don't. What is it?" "To begin with," said the princess, "I am going to ask you to come and have a little private chat with me. It isn't quite the sort of thing that I can explain to you here, but really I can assure you that to me it is of the most vital importance. It is rather hard," she went on in a whisper, "that a shadow, and a rather dark one too, should fall across a woman's life path on her wedding day. But that has happened to me, and you are the only one that can help me clear it away. Perhaps you understand?" "Yes," said Grace, remembering what her husband had said at breakfast-time 3 mornings before. "I think I do. At least, if it has anything to do with Mr. Seaman's, and a case of questioned identity." "Exactly," whispered the princess. "That horrible rumour reached me only last night, on the eve of my wedding day, but my faith goes where my love goes, and by something like a miracle my husband has, within the last few hours, received evidence which enables him to absolutely destroy all ground for that terrible suspicion. We had hoped your husband would be here, but we will give the proofs to you, that you may give them to him. Now will you come with me?" "Of course I will," replied Grace. "Who am I that I should refuse to make a bride happier upon her wedding day?" "Thank you, dearest," whispered the princess. "You will truly be my good angel if you will. Now we will go and say good afternoon to our mutual friends. You can tell them that you are going to stop a little while with me, and I shall have a message sent to your coachman to wait for further orders, and then we can go and have our talk." They made their adieu, and Grace followed the radiant bride out of the reception-room and down the long curtained corridor which led to the sanctuary of secrets. "This, I think, dear Mrs. Enstone," said the princess very sweetly, drawing the red curtain aside and opening the door, "is one of the most interesting rooms in the Institute, and only those of us who are earnest students of the mysteries have been admitted so far, and as I want our little talk to be very private, I've taken the responsibility of bringing you here." She stood aside, holding the door half open, and Grace walked past her with her head slightly bowed. The next instant the door closed sharply behind her. She raised her head, and to her utter amazement, her eyes met those of Jenner Halkyne, the convict, who, as she had believed for the last 3 years, had paid the penalty which discharges all the debts of humanity and opens the prison gates forever. "Uncle! Uncle, is it really you? No, it can't be possible. You've been dead." "In one sense, yes, my dear Grace," replied the long familiar voice as he came towards her, his eyes staring straight into hers. "Socially and professionally, yes, but physically, as you can see, no. Circumstances have unfortunately compelled us to be strangers for too long, but thanks to the princess and her husband, with whom we shall have a little important talk shortly, I am able to renew your acquaintance, and this time I trust that it will not be broken off quite so abruptly as it was before." As he had gone on speaking, every word had come more slowly from his lips, and his eyes had come closer and closer to hers. He put out his hands and clasped her temples. She saw his 2 eyes merge into one all-compelling visual force which she recognized as the once familiar instrument of the masterful soul behind the eye. Her own sight grew dim, her senses began to wander. She struggled hard to keep her self-control, but it was no use. Her limbs relaxed, and she began to sway from side to side. She had a sense of being caught and lifted up, and then, through the mists of the dreamland into which she was sinking, she heard a voice which she dimly recognized as the princess's, saying, "It's very wonderful, Doctor. I don't think there should be any great difficulty after this." End of Chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of A Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by DavidReader. A Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science by George Griffith. Chapter 28. Can you not see, Dr. Halkyne, that all things considered, the course which I propose is the only practicable, in fact the only possible one for all of us? By some means or other, your continual existence and presence here have become suspected. You know perfectly well that if Harold Enstone can send you back to prison, he will, and this time there will be no escape. You know also that I have the best of reasons for wishing him permanently out of the way. I won't say that his existence is quite as dangerous to me as it is to you, but it is sufficiently so to be exceedingly unpleasant. Now, here we have an opportunity which could hardly come to us again. You will assume one of those admirable disguises of yours, and come with us to Natiefberg. Your niece, as I think you prefer to call her, your daughter. Yes, interrupted Jenner Halkyne, in a voice like the snarl of an angry dog. Of course you know that too, and therefore the reason. I do, replied Siemens gravely, looking at him with unconcealed disgust. And therefore I know that you are the most unspeakable mixture of madman and scoundrel that ever was allowed to live. However, for decency's sake, we will call her your niece. If you come, she must, and when we get into the safe seclusion of Natiefberg, you will cause her to write a note to her husband saying that at the last moment the princess had persuaded her to accompany us on our trip as far as Paris. We can send her carriage back for her maid and the necessary luggage. There will be plenty of time for that before we catch the train. Then the letter from Natiefberg will bring her husband there hot foot, and meanwhile we can arrange for the necessary accident to happen to him. Of course I know that I am talking to one of the greatest criminals, potentially at least, that exists, replied Halkyne slowly. I would rid the earth of you if I could, but unfortunately, perhaps for the world, neither you nor I can harm each other. Therefore, as we must live, we may as well do so in the most convenient fashion. As you know, I have nothing to live for except science, but for that I would live 1,000 years if I could. In comparison with science, I hold nothing of any value, and therefore I agree. although I know you ought to be killed for even thinking of what you wish to do. For me, it is a choice between continuing the glorious and mighty work that I have begun at the Institute, a work which before I die will place me on the throne of the world with statesmen and monarchs as my servants and puppets, and the living death of the prison. Therefore, Harold Enstone shall come to Natiefburg and never leave it. And when that danger to us both, which is incarnate in him, has ceased to exist, I will go back to my work, will live my life, and you will live yours. There will be no need for us to meet again." "I quite agree with you," said Hedley Siemens, taking a cigar out of his case and snipping the end with his cutter. "It is just as well that people who know each other as intimately as you and I do should keep as far apart as possible. You perform your part of the bargain, and I'll perform mine. As soon as Harold Enstone has been duly abolished, I will give you $1 million's worth of negotiable securities, and we will say goodbye, I hope, forever, at least as far as this existence is concerned. What we shall be in the next, well, we needn't trouble ourselves about that for the present. If we get what we deserve, I suppose we shall be reborn as the children of pickpockets, and grow up in the slums on the edge of starvation, and steal for a living, and go to prison as an occasional diversion. One life at a time, if you please," said Halkine, with a smile which was anything but mirthful. "Who are we that we should anticipate the intentions of internal wisdom?" "Well, we won't trouble about that now," said Siemens, getting up. "This is a curious sort of conversation for a man to have on his wedding day, but of course one can't trifle with necessities. Then you will be ready to start with us for Paris this evening? You know we shall have a special train, and my yacht will be waiting at Dover, so we shall have quite a comfortable trip." "Yes," replied Halkine, "I shall be ready. And now perhaps the princess had better arrange for Grace's maid to bring what she will want." He got up and opened the door of his own sanctum in which this conversation had taken place, and Hedley Siemens went in search of his bride to discuss the final details of the villainous plot with her. Of all the facts which are repeated over and over in the history of crime, the most remarkable is that no matter how daringly or how skilfully a crime is planned, some apparently trifling detail, which might or might not have been foreseen, is left out of the calculation, and more often than not either upsets the whole scheme or becomes the means of bringing the criminal to justice after the crime has been committed. Now it will be admitted that the crime which Hedley Siemens and Kara Natief had planned, and which Jenner Halkine, in his insane devotion to what he believed to be the preeminent interests of science, was as foul and revolting in its nature as it was clever in the simplicity of its conception. Apparently nothing had been overlooked. Grace, once more, completely under the influence of the overmastering, although deranged, intellect of her father, would travel with them, just as though she were the guest instead of, as she might be called, a mental prisoner. There would be no suspicion. Not even her maid would be able to detect the fact that she was not the mistress of her own actions. She would reach Natiefburg practically without knowing how or why she had come. Then, at Halkine's dictation, she would write a letter to her husband, which would bring him, wondering perhaps, but unsuspicious of evil, to the princess's stronghold in the Polish wilderness. There the deadly work would be done in such fashion as would leave no trace of anything. But Grace's maid happened to be a North Country girl, the daughter, in fact, of one of Sir Godfrey's tenants, who had shown signs of peculiar brightness, which had attracted Sir Godfrey's attention. He knew that Harold would some day marry, and, by a most happy chance, he selected this girl as a possible maid for his future wife. He had her well educated, perhaps somewhat beyond her station in life, but her quick intellect had amply justified his choice, and the consequence was that Grace came into the possession of a lady's maid very far above the average, and, moreover, gratefully devoted to the fortunes of the house of Enstone, in the person of Miss Lucy Marrett. When the carriage came back with the message from her mistress, she at once set to work on her packing, but while she was engaged on this task, her shrewd wits were also working rapidly, and by one way or another she speedily arrived at the conclusion that the first person who ought to know about this curious journey was her master, and the result of this very essential little piece of thinking was that, late that evening, Unhappily, just too late to get a train to the south, Harold Enstone, in a remote village in Northumberland, which was to be the centre of the new iron fields, received by a mounted messenger a telegram, which to his utter amazement told him that his wife was starting, indeed had started, for Paris, as the guest of Hedley Siemens and his wife on their wedding tour. His first idea was to wire Colonel Raoul Grover, who was the one man in London whom he felt he could absolutely depend, and ask him to follow Grace to Paris, and to bring her back by any means that he might find possible. But a moment's reflection told him the Colonel could not possibly cross the Channel until the next morning, and by that time, if Hedley Siemens and his wife really had any sinister designs upon Grace, they certainly would have made pursuit for the present impossible. The telegram told him that the party were travelling by a special train, and that Siemens' yacht was to take them from Dover to France. But whether Calais or Boulogne it did not say, and for the matter of that, what was to prevent Hedley Siemens, who, as he now felt certain, had every reason to fear him, and therefore injure him, from taking the yacht anywhere else? She was a 1,000-tonner, one of the finest yachts afloat, and could go anywhere. Once away from Dover, and every trace of her might be lost for days and weeks, she could run down to the Mediterranean, and idle about there among the Ionian Islands, or in the island-studded Aegean. She could take a passage around the Cape to Australia, coal up at one of the Australian ports, and spend a year or so among the South Sea Islands. She could run across the Atlantic, coal at Kingston, and get away down to the east coast of South America, where Hedley Siemens' millions would buy him absolute immunity from the operations of all civilized law, until it was too late for the law to act. He could do anything, because he possessed the first two factors of civilization, money and the means of rapid transit. He was fully convinced now that Hedley Siemens was the scoundrel whom he had hoped to run to earth, but what a hostage to fortune he had so skilfully and so suddenly captured. How many horrible possibilities were there just in the simple fact that Grace was the guest, and very possibly the prisoner, of Collier Banfield and his Polish wife. His early training under his father and Sir Godfrey in the wild life that they had led in the outlands of the earth had taught him what is perhaps the most invaluable lesson that a man can learn: to think quickly and to act instantaneously on the thought. This is what he did now. He had crushed the telegram up in his hand. He had spread it out again and read it, took out his watch, and said between his teeth, "If I can only catch the 5 train from Newcastle to London tonight, I'd be in London by 11 in the morning. But damn it all, I'm 25 miles from the nearest station on the main line. I can't possibly catch it. No, it's no good tonight, I'm afraid." He was striding up and down the little sitting room he had taken at the inn, chewing half-inches off a cigar which he was trying to smoke, while these agonizing thoughts were chasing each other through his brain. He stopped and threw himself down into an armchair and said, biting each syllable off as it came, "Now what the devil am I to do?" The next moment he heard the rattle of machinery, a loud toot-toot under the window. He jumped up and looked out. "Thank God, there's Hargreaves with his Panhard. He'll get me there in time. She'll do it in 15 minutes. He ran downstairs just as the big 40-horsepower motor car owned by his partner, Hargreaves, the man with whom he was working against other iron and coal kings, stopped panting, puffing, and stinking at the door. He had snatched his golf cap off the peg in the hall as he ran out, but he had forgotten he had left his coat off in order to do a cool and luxurious smoke and think at the end of the long northern summer afternoon. "Hello, Enstone!" exclaimed Arthur Hargreaves, millionaire, mine owner, and much fined motorist. "What the deuce is the matter with you? Your costume seems a bit different to mine," he went on, as he climbed out of the big car, capped, goggled, and leather-coated. "Nothing serious, I hope?" Enstone caught him by the arm and pulled him away out of the hearing of his chauffeur. "It's everything that's serious to me, Hargreaves," he said in a hurried whisper. "I'm in a difficulty, and a bad one, and you're the only man who can help me get out of it." "Anything you like, old man. What is it? If it's anything that wants speed in it, well, here you are, 65 miles an hour, and hang on the police. We can afford the fines, I think, if it's anything urgent." "Well, that's just it," replied Harold. "Never mind about the details just now. I'm 25 miles from Enstone and 60 from Newcastle, and I want to catch the 5 express to town or to get a special. It's something more than life or death to me, but I will tell you afterwards. Can you do it for me?" "Do it, my dear chap," replied the owner of the mechanical monster that was panting, rattling, and throbbing, as though it had made up his mind to either burst or go flying away down the long straight road. "Do it. The roads are open enough. There's very little traffic here. and I will put you into Newcastle inside 80 minutes, bar accidents, and then I can give you plenty of time to pack your portmanteau and have a whiskey and soda with me." "Good enough," said Harold, putting his hand on his shoulder. "Come and have that whiskey and soda. By the Lord, Harry, you are a friend indeed this time, Hargreaves." Within 10 minutes he had taken his place beside Hargreaves on the panting, shuddering machine. The horn hooted twice. Hargreaves turned the wheel, and with a swift series of angry snorts, as though it were venting its rage at having its powers so long restrained, the great motor car bounded forward and vanished in a cloud of dust away down the long, solitary country road. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Fraser Shepherdson. Melbourne. A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science by George Griffith. Chapter 29. Hargreaves and his chauffeur made the big Panhard do its best, and it thumped and bounded and jumped along the roads, anywhere between 60 and 70 miles an hour, until, within about 15 miles of Newcastle, it became absolutely necessary to slow down or run the risk of manslaughter. "Sorry, old man," said Hargreaves, "but I really must do it. We can't go charging through these little villages at the speed of the Flying Scotchman. There you are. Great Caesar! We nearly did some damage there. I'm afraid I've hurt the kid after all." He shut the power off, jammed the brake down hard, and brought the throbbing, panting monster to a standstill almost within its own length. "I am afraid you have," said Harold, jumping out of the car and running back about 20 yards to where the little girl was standing with her knuckles dug into her eyes, surrounded by a small but vociferous crowd. "I'm very sorry," he said, breaking through the circle, and taking the girl by her shoulders, and lifting her from the ground. He put her onto her feet again, and she stood upright, though still shaking with the fright. "Fortunately, it's a case of more frightened than hurt. I don't think it touched you after all, little woman. Come now, I'm in a hurry. See if these won't make you feel a bit better." He pulled his sovereign case out of his right waistcoat pocket, rattled 6 sovereigns and a half-sovereign out of it, took hold of her little tear-stained hand, put them into it, closed the fist, broke through the circle again, and jumped into the car. "Right away, Hargreaves. Let her go. I am afraid that will miss us the train." The car jumped away into space, but now it was necessary to slow down time after time as they passed through the more and more crowded narrow streets leading into the northeastern metropolis. The car ran up one side of the semicircle in front of the Newcastle station at perhaps a little over regulation speed. "Very sorry, Enstone, but I'm afraid we have missed it," said Hargreaves, as he brought the volcanic monster to a standstill under the clock tower. Harold jumped out, ran into the station, collided with an inspector whom he caught by the shoulders. "Here, where are you going at a speed like that?" "Oh, I beg your pardon, Mr. Enstone." "Excuse me, but is there anything serious the matter?" "Yes, I beg your pardon, Hawkins, running into you like this, but there is really something very serious the matter, and I've missed the up express, haven't I?" "Yes, sir, you have, by about 2 minutes and a half." That was the kid's fault for nearly getting in the way, thought Harold rapidly. "Now look here, Hawkins," he went on, taking his hands from the inspector's shoulders. "I've got to get to London in the shortest possible time, even if I have missed the express. I know you always have 1 or 2 good engines round here. Go and tell the station master to get one of those coupled up to a carriage of some sort, and pull it in just as quickly as he can. He needn't worry about the cost, but he must wire up the line, stop everything, and give me a free run to King's Cross. Hurry up now." He turned away and went back to the motor car. "She's gone, Hargreaves, but perhaps I can get a special. If I can, will you come to London with me? As a matter of fact, I want a man like you, and I don't know too many of your sort in England, and I believe you've got a bit of influence on this line, haven't you? And I have some." "What's up, Enstone? Give me the facts, quick. And if you are in real trouble, I needn't say that. I know that, Hargreaves. The trouble is just this. It may not be very understandable to you just now, but I will explain it when we get into the special. My wife has by some absolutely mysterious means been persuaded to go to Paris, and after that to the Lord knows where, on a honeymoon trip with Hedley Simons and his bride, Cara Natif. I just got the telegram at the moment you stopped at the inn up there. You've come too fast for me to speak, or I would have told you before, but that's so. Oh, good Lord, replied Hargreaves, getting out of the car. And from what I happen to know of Mr. H.S., I suppose you are pretty anxious to stop that little excursion. Look here. I fortunately happen to know Mr. Sanderson, the district superintendent here. In fact, I did a little bit towards getting him his berth, and if there is anything in the way of specials that he can manage, he'll do it. Come along now, and we'll see. They went into the station, and the inspector met them. He touched the peak of his cap to Harold and said, "I've seen the station master, sir, and he'll be glad to see you in his office. This way, sir, if you please. And as it just happens, the line superintendent is with him." "Oh, that's all right then," said Hargreaves. "I think we can manage things all right now. Come along." The interview with the station master and the line superintendent was not very long, but it was very much to the point. Both Harold Enstone and Hargreaves were known as men to whom money, even in thousands, was of very little account. And when Harold said, after a very brief interview to the superintendent, "Look here, sir, I will give you £1,000 if you will clear the line and run Mr. Hargreaves and myself through to King's Cross in the fastest possible time. Shunt everything. I'll pay any loss there may be to the company through delay, but I want to get there." He took his cheque-book out of the right-hand pocket of his Norfolk jacket and stylographic pen out of the left-hand pocket of his waistcoat, sat down at the table and wrote out a cheque for £1,000 payable to the district superintendent to the account of the Great Northern Railway Company. He blotted it, tore it off, threw it across the table. "There you are, Mr. Sanderson. Now what can you do for me?" The superintendent picked up the little slip of paper which meant so much, looked at it, and then at the station master. Then he put the cheque down again on the table, took the station master by the arm, and led him away from the table for a few moments, during which he engaged him in a hurried, whispered conversation, punctuated with frequent nods of the station master's head. Then the superintendent came back to the table and said, "It is not in my power, Mr. Enstone, to accept this cheque of yours, but if you will allow it to remain in the safe until the manager comes in the morning, I will take it on my own responsibility to clear the line for you and give you a couple of saloon cars and one of our new flyers that we are going to race the Northwestern with. She's been running one of her trial trips today, and she has to steam up. I'll have her ready alongside the platform in 10 minutes, and she'll take you to London inside 3 hours. That's about half an hour in front of the Scotchman." "I'm there," said Enstone, getting up and tossing the cheque towards him. "You can do what you like with that. I'll buy the engine if you like, but have her ready quick. You needn't worry about the cars. It wouldn't be the first time that I've had a run on an engine." "The cars are here, sir," replied the superintendent, "and the engine shall be at the platform in a few minutes. Mr. Andrews, will you kindly wire down the line and clear it? Everything through from here to King's Cross. She'll about overtake the express at Peterborough, but we don't want any accidents." "There won't be any fear of that," said the station master. "Specials are specials, and everything else has to keep out of the way for them. That'll be all right, Mr. Enstone." "And now," said Hargreaves, "I think we may as well go and get a whisky and soda, and have some provisions for the trip put on board. If you only have a good digestion, eating and drinking are a great relief from the variegated worries of life. Come along. Let's go and find the bar." About 10 minutes later, they were standing on the platform in front of a long corridor carriage with a big postal brake van behind it. There happened to be a very heavy correspondence from the north to London that evening, and so the superintendent had taken advantage of the special to get away a few dozen bags which had been too late for the mail. A long, high-shouldered, short-funnelled, green-painted, and yet withal graceful shape came sliding in on its 14 smoothly revolving wheels, until it touched the buffers of the saloon car, hissing, snorting, and vibrating throughout the length and breadth of its steel fabric with the suppressed energy of the 3,000 horsepower which its boilers and furnaces were ready to put into its compound cylinders. As the buffers touched, the superintendent went to the footplate and said to the driver, a grizzled descendant of some Norse invader of 1,000 years back, "Jock, you are to drive her for all she's worth. We've cleared the line for you, and if ever 999 had a chance of a record, you've got one now." "And if the way is right, she'll make it," replied Jock, pulling his beard and looking from end to end of the steel darling of his widowed life. "And every minute that you make over ordinary time will be worth £1 to you, and here's something to begin with," said Harold Enstone, putting a £5 note into his hand. "And now, as soon as you are ready, I am." "All right, gentlemen," replied the driver, climbing back into the cab. "And thank you, sir. As soon as you have taken your places, we'll be off." The superintendent conducted the two millionaires to the door of the long saloon carriage, shut it, touched his cap, and signalled right away to the driver. There was a shrill hiss of steam under the great engine, and with an almost imperceptible motion, Harold Enstone's special slid out of the station and crossed the long high-level bridge over the Tyne. Then the great engine settled down to its work. Jock let her go, and she did go. He knew that he had an almost perfect, permanent way under him, and a clear road in front of him, and so, when he had cleared the outlying stations, he threw the throttle valve open and gave her her head. Conversation soon became impossible for Enstone and Hargreaves, and so they laid down on the sofas of the luxuriously furnished saloon and surrendered themselves, even in spite of their anxiety, to the rapturous delight of rapid travel. They heard the whistle shriek and saw the lights of Gateshead flash past them in a swift, continuous gleam. They roared out into the darkness. The moon and the stars danced and jumped about the heavens as the great engine and its two satellites plunged thundering through the night. The fields and the scattered woods and the coppices on either side of the line melted into a confused blur. The lights of hamlets and towns a few miles away from the line jumped out of the growing darkness, shone for a moment, and vanished. The special rushed, shrieking and roaring through Peterborough, where the Scotchman lay waiting on a siding, and sped away out into the darkness again. The lights of Grantham glittered out ahead. Number 999 shrieked and thundered through the long station, and the next moment the lights were lost behind. She covered the 104 miles to King's Cross in 80 minutes, and when they ran up alongside the platform at King's Cross, as easily and smoothly as though nothing had been done out of the common, and the Green Giant came to a stop, fizzling as modestly as a tea kettle, Enstone went to the driver with his watch in hand and said, "I think that was a rather fine performance. You were almost an hour ahead of the express this time." 83 miles an hour, sir," replied Jock, "and if it hadn't been for the junctions and the cross lines, I could have made it 90 with safety. She's as fine a bit of machinery as ever run on metals. Talk about your Yankee engines, I'd pull one of them backwards and then make pretty good time, and if it came to racing, I could get 100 out of her easy." "Yes, I dare say you could," replied Enstone. "I know you have done your best, but I'm afraid we have cut it too fine. Well, here you are," he continued, putting 4 £5 notes into his hand. "Share up with your mate. Good night. Now, Hargreaves, quick, a smart hansom. Yes, that will do. Pile in, Charing Cross," he shouted to the driver. "As hard as you can go. I will pay the fine if you hurt anyone." The horse was a good one, and the man a good driver. Instead of keeping to the main streets, he went away down the less crowded thoroughfares. Enstone made the journey with a watch in his hand, and at last, as they were bowling down Charing Cross Road, he snapped the case of his watch too, threw himself back with a comprehensive American curse, and said, "It's no good, old man. It's 9 o'clock. These southeastern trains do sometimes start punctually whatever time they get there, and we cannot hire a great northern flyer here." The horse skated and clattered up into the station. Harold drew the doors open and shouted to a porter, "Has the boat train gone?" "Yes, sir, 4 minutes ago." Harold jumped out, gave the cabman a sovereign, and strode onto the platform. He found an important official with plenty of gold lace on his cap and asked him if there were any chance of a special to catch the boat at Dover. The official pondered deeply for a few intolerable moments and then said with exasperating slowness, "Well, no, sir. I'm afraid not tonight. At least, one could not be got ready in less than an hour, even if we had an engine, and, you see, the expresses are all out." "Yes," said Harold. "I ought to have known that none of your old kettles on wheels on this line would have done it. I got a special at Newcastle in 10 minutes, and got here under 3 hours. And this company cannot do 76 miles and catch the boat? Are you sure?" "If you will come with me to the station master's office, sir, I will see if anything can be done," replied the official, in a tone of injured dignity. Harold followed him, fuming with rage, and yet not willing to miss even the limited chance of getting what he wanted, but the station master only repeated what his subordinate had said. The traffic on the line was very heavy just then, and a special to catch the boat was quite out of the question, added to which it would be impossible to get the boat and the train on the French side. "It's no good, Hargreaves. We can do nothing tonight," he said as he left the office. "These people have not got an engine that could catch the boat train. It is only what one might have expected from the amalgamated crawlers. Now the best thing we can do is to get away to the Colonel's, and if he happens by good luck to be at home, we might get some information out of him. It is infernally annoying, but I suppose there's no help for it." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Fraser Shepherdson, Melbourne. A Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science by George Griffith. Chapter 30. Fortunately, the Rowell Grovers were having an early, quiet dinner at home that night, prior to indulging in a couple of frivolous hours at the palace. They were naturally somewhat surprised to see Enstone, who was not expected back for 3 or 4 days. He apologised for the sudden invasion, introduced his friend Hargreaves, and with his usual directness, got to business at once. To his disgust, but not altogether to his astonishment, he learned that they knew nothing of Grace's departure for the continent. All Mrs. Grover could tell him was that the princess had brought a message from Grace to herself and Lady Georgina, to the effect that Grace had been a little overcome by the heat and had a headache, so she was lying down for half an hour with the princess's maid looking after her. "Then of course that settles it," said Enstone. "If this trip had been all fair and square, Grace would certainly not have gone without sending me a wire, and she would certainly not have sent such a message as that to you. Instead of the princess brings you a message, which is probably a lie, sends the carriage home for Lucy and some luggage, and vanishes. Now, my dear Mrs. Grover, is that the sort of thing that Grace would be likely to do?" "It is certainly very extraordinary," she replied, "but the idea of her being taken away against her will, if that is what you mean, is surely out of the question. This is the 20th century, you know, Mr. Enstone, not the 18th. "Yes," he replied, "but money can still work miracles." "Quite so," said the Colonel. "But my dear Enstone, people don't run such a tremendous risk as that of, well, if you like, we will say abducting, the wife of a millionaire and a member of Parliament and one of the best-known women in society, without some very strong motive. And what earthly reason could Hedley Simmons and the Princess have for such an amazing act, and on their own wedding trip, too?" "I think I can throw some light on that," replied Enstone. Then he gave them a rapid outline of his suspicions as to Simmons' identity with the desperado, Banfield, and the means he had taken to satisfy himself upon the point. "Now," he continued, "if I am right and he knows it, he is just the man to go to any length for either revenge or self-protection." "But my dear fellow," said the Colonel, "granted all that, how could they possibly have got her away unless she had gone of her own free will? As Fanny said just now, you can't carry well-known women off to the coasts and put them on board a yacht, Viet Amis, nowadays, and, besides, they've gone to Paris. I have not the slightest doubt you will have a letter from her in the morning or a telegram." "I wish I could believe it," replied Enstone, shaking his head. "But I can't. Something bad has happened, I'm absolutely certain. I think Grace must have given me some of that queer power of second sight of hers, or else I got it from some northern ancestor, for I am absolutely certain that she is in danger, and great danger. Good heavens! I believe I've got it," he exclaimed, suddenly getting up from his chair. "Got what?" said Mrs. Grover. "Second sight or an idea?" "Both, I think," he replied. "The one suggested the other. That fellow, Isaiah Ramal at the Institute, I'm sure he has the same uncanny powers as that villain Halkine had, and at one time Grace was very susceptible to hypnotic influence or whatever the infernal thing is. Now, suppose they got her under Ramal's influence and suggested the trip to Paris. She would go just as though she went of her own free will. No one would notice anything out of the way about her, and they could take her where they liked. Then, when they got her safely stowed away somewhere in the wilds of Poland or Russia, of course Siemens, alias Banfield, could make what terms he liked with her. That's what they've done it for. He couldn't have any other motive." Harold Enstone had got nearer to the facts than any of his hearers really believed, and it was well for him that he did not know the whole of the horrible truth. He wanted all his energy and wits about him if Grace was to be found, and the knowledge that she was threatened by the hideous fate that Kara Natif and her husband had doomed her to might well have gone far towards unhinging his mind for the time being. "Well, I must say there might be something in that," said Mrs. Grover, who had, or believed she had, a very strong leaning towards the occult, and was already inclined to look upon the famous doctor and director of the Institute as the high priest of a new religion. "Everyone says that Dr. Ramal does possess the most remarkable powers, but, Mr. Enstone, I am perfectly convinced that he would never use them for such an abominable purpose as that. He is far too distinguished, and, I am certain, too good a man to lend himself to anything of that sort." "Well, for the sake of your confidence, I hope he is, Mrs. Rowell Grover. But he is an Oriental, and I know enough about the East to trust an Oriental about as far as I could throw him with one hand. But that's not the question now, and we've troubled you quite enough. You had better come back and sleep at my place, Hargreaves. Then, if you are inclined for a man-hunt on the continent, we'll be off by the mail tomorrow morning. Of course, I shall have to put off that business in the north for the present, but don't let me haul you away unless you feel you can come without hurting things." "I think the others will be able to fix that business up now if we send them a wire giving them the full powers to act," replied Hargreaves, on whom the excitement of the prospective chase had already taken hold. "And if I can be of the slightest use to you, I'm there." "Of course you can," said Enstone. "You're just the man I want, and I don't think it will be quite the sort of journey that will be good for one to be alone on." "I should think not," said the Colonel. "And if I can be of any service to you here, of course, command me as one entirely at your disposal. For instance, as you'll be pretty busy, suppose I wire to all the likely hotels in Paris, find out where they are stopping, and let you know, say, at the Bristol? We've an office near here that's open all night, and as they went over in Simmons' yacht, of course, we can find out its whereabouts. And now, just before you go, you must have a whiskey and soda to help you on your way." Enstone and Hargreaves drove to the Prince's Gardens in almost absolute silence, only broken now and then by the strange oaths in many languages which escaped between Harold's tightly clenched teeth. His friend knew what his feelings must be, and respected them. He had not been married quite as long as Enstone, and so it was not difficult for him to sum up the situation. When Harold opened the door with his latchkey, a footman rose from a chair and straightened himself up in a somewhat sleepy fashion, and said, "There's a gentleman in the library to see you, sir. I told him you were out of town, but he said he thought he would wait till midnight in case you did come back. I think the gentleman's an American, sir. This is his card, sir." Harold took it up and looked at it, and read, "Albert J. Cantor, 150 Water Street, Liverpool." "Can't say I know the gentleman," said Harold, "but come along, Hargreaves. We may as well go and make his acquaintance. I suppose it's something important, or he wouldn't be quite so persistent." As they went into the library, a tall, well-dressed man got out of an armchair and came to meet them. He was a man of about 50, well-preserved and set up, and with the iron-grey hair and dark moustache so often found among Americans who have fought hard in the battle of life and won. Mr. Cantor, I believe. My name is Enstone. I am afraid we have kept you waiting a long time. This is my friend, Mr. Hargreaves. We have only just come back from the north of England." "Good evening, Mr. Enstone," said the stranger, with just the slightest transatlantic intonation. "I am afraid it is I who have taken the liberty, but I had an urgent cable from my old friend Judge Bromyard, mayor of Pine Bluff City, at Liverpool this morning about you and a mutual friend of ours. And as I happen to be in the country and know the man pretty well, I thought I had better come on right ahead as advance guard. 4 old citizens of Pine Bluff will be here the day after tomorrow to complete the identification you ask for beyond doubt. I have wired to you in the north to the address your man gave me, but I reckon you won't have had that yet, as it only went this afternoon. Anyway, I thought I'd wait a bit in case you did arrive." "Quite right, Mr. Cantor," said Harold, putting his finger on the bell push. "Sit down. Of course you will take a whiskey and soda and have a cigar. My man ought to have offered you something before. Now, about this identification. I am sorry to say that only this very day the man that I believe to be Collier Banfield married a Polish princess and went off to the continent, and, what is more, the happy couple managed in some mysterious way to persuade my wife to go with them at a few moments' notice, and without letting me know. To be quite frank, I suspect foul play. If Collier Banfield has any hand in it, you can bet your life it won't be any too clean a business," replied the American. "I knew him pretty well in the rough days out there, and I never knew anything good of him yet. And so he's blossomed out into Hedley Simmons, millionaire, railway king, gold king, and all the rest of it." "That's what has to be proved yet," replied Enstone. "But personally I feel morally certain of it. But at present, as you will understand, I am rather more concerned about my wife. Mr. Hargreaves and I are crossing to Paris by the next train to see if we can get on his tracks." "Well," said Mr. Cantor, "if there's anything like a chance of running Collier Banfield down by a man who knows him from the roots of his hair to the soles of his feet, and doesn't like a little bit of him, and can be of any service to you, I reckon I'll come too." "Nothing would please me better," replied Enstone. "Hello, what's that? Sounds like a wire." A thundering double knock resounded through the quiet hall, and presently the door opened and a footman came in with a telegram marked for urgent delivery. Harold almost snatched it out of his hand, tore it open, and at the next moment said to Hargreaves, "Well, I'll be kicked. Read that." And Hargreaves read, "Mr. Simmons and Princess married today. Took sudden resolve to run over to Paris with them, and now they have persuaded me to go with them to her castle Natifberg, northeastern Poland. Will you follow when business is settled? Good sport, and delighted to see you. Grace." The telegram had been sent from Calais to Enstone, and repeated, via Newcastle, by an intelligent clerk who knew that Harold had left by the special. "Either you are entirely wrong," said Hargreaves, "or it is a trap." "I believe it is a trap," said Harold. "And anyhow, Grace is in it, so I'm going. Mr. Cantor, if you care to join us on the trip, will you meet us at Charing Cross a little before 9? "I'll be there," replied the American, meaningly, his hand wandering instinctively towards his hip pocket. "And if Collier Banfield really is in it, I guess we ought to have some good sport before we get back." "I hope so very much," said Harold. "Now, we may as well have a smoke and a drink, and see if we can knock out some sort of a plan of campaign." End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Fraser Shepherdson, Melbourne. A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science by George Griffith. Chapter 31. Natifberg, which had been the home and stronghold of Kara Natif's ancestry ever since the dim old days when it had been a fortress of logs fenced about by triple stockades of outward-pointing, sloping stakes, was now a curious mixture of medieval castle and 18th-century pleasure house. It stood on the topmost rise of a promontory about 500 feet high, which jutted out between a very considerable river and an inconsiderable tributary, which joined its sluggish flow to the main stream about 7 miles from the broad entrance into the Baltic. For the rest, the vast forest-clad regions which lay south and east and west of it, and the long sandy reaches to the north, were a sort of debatable ground between the Russian and the German empires. Most of the princess's ancestors had died fighting one or other of the two encroaching despotisms as occasion demanded, and the inhabitants of the region, foresters, huntsmen, charcoal burners, small farmers, and fishermen, still hated both with a cordial impartiality. The long northern summer was still in the midmost height of its glory. The forests and the vast, interspersed stretches of meadow and cornland were like dark green oceans dotted with islands of gold and emeralds, and the sands were golden too. The ripples of the shallow sea, like long lines of frosted silver, and the waters of the Baltic beyond, almost as smooth as a sea of ice, glittered with a million ripples. The older portion of the castle, the high, round keep, and the thick crumbling walls, flanked at every corner and angle as they climbed round the sides of the headland, were flanked with round watchtowers, all ivy and moss-grown, like the rest of the ruin, and grey with the age of many centuries. Below the remains of the great outer bastions, and fronting a magnificent sweep of the great gleaming river, fringed to its edge with dusky lines of giant pines, and yet divided from the forest by flower-covered terraces and smooth green lawns sloping away into the gloom of the wilderness, was the modern schloss built of red bricks that had been burned over 3 centuries before, turreted at the corners and roofed with tiles blackened and moss-grown as old as the bricks. It was here that Kara Natif had brought her strangely won husband, and her no less strangely invited guests, present and to come, in order that she might, as she believed, enjoy the complete fruition at once of her love for the man that she loved, and her revenge on the woman whom, in a sense, he loved better than herself, and, bleak and ghastly as these northern wildernesses were when once the shroud of winter fell over them, they were very beautiful now, with a weird and sombre beauty, which no southern landscape can show. In a word, the scene exactly suited both the mood and beauty of the woman who owned everything, but the sea as far as the eye could reach from the topmost tower of Natifberg. According to the old custom of the land, Princess Kara and her husband occupied separate sleeping chambers, communicating with each other by a curtained archway. Very early in the morning of the 3rd day after their arrival, in fact, soon after the brief northern night had ended, she was lying awake with many thoughts revolving in her mind, when she heard her husband's voice in the next room speaking in Spanish, a language which she of course understood, but which he had never used in converse with her. The words came slowly and brokenly, with little intervals of silent, deep breathing between them, but the first few that she had heard were quite enough to bring the blood to her cheeks and the fire to her eyes. The truth was that, like nearly all men who have passed a great part of their lives in the silences and solitudes of the outlands of the world, Hedley Simons had contracted the habit of talking to himself, which strongly conduces to sleep-talking, and, curiously enough, yet by no means singularly, he never spoke but one language in his sleep, and that was Spanish. "Oh, gracia, gracissima." These were the words which flushed her cheeks and kindled her eyes. She sat up in bed and listened with tensely strained ears. There was a little pause, and he went on again, in those words slow and broken, yet for her fatally distinct. "Thou knowest that I love thee, and thee alone. Thou alone art the love of my heart, the light of my eyes, the star of my life. Shall I tell thee again that I married her only to get possession of thy sweet self, and obtain vengeance on that husband of thine who has ruined me? It was the easiest way, and... Bah! What matters another crime or two? He is coming here, lured by the knowledge of thy sweet presence, coming to his death, for we shall kill him. But it must be she that will kill him. She and that evil-eyed uncle of thine shall kill him. The guilt shall be theirs, and the penalty of it. Then we shall be free, and all these lands shall be mine, and in this beautiful wilderness, far away from the world, we will taste the joys of a new paradise." By this time Princess Cara was out of bed, a morning wrapper girdled round her, and soft, noiseless slippers of down on her feet. She was white now to the lips, and her eyes were blazing and black with anger. She went to a splendid black old oak cabinet, which nearly covered the end wall of the room, ran her fingers quickly over the apparently solid wood at one end of it about 5 feet from the floor, and presently a little panel flew out. She put her hand into the space behind and drew out a richly chased silver box, about 4 inches square. She touched a spring at one of the corners, and the lid slid off. Inside were 8 tiny stoppered bottles of clearest crystal. She took out the 7th and looked at it against the light. It was 3 parts full of a very pale greenish liquid, the famous, or rather infamous, aqua tofana, which, with the other deadly liquids in the case, had been handed down by her ancestors from the time of the Borgias. What she had done had occupied the space of only a few moments, and, meanwhile, she had heard more softly spoken words coming brokenly from the sleeper's lips, and they were such as only served to strengthen the deadly resolve which she had taken. "And so I have loved and married a traitor who has outwitted me, moreover, and used me, Cara Natif, as a mere means to an end. He has not only cheated me, but he has dishonoured me as well. There can be no forgiveness for that, and no traitor ever entered the halls of Natifburg and left them alive. It shall not be for me, the last of the race, to break the tradition." The words were not spoken or even whispered. They only ran like so many lightning flashes through her mind as she moved noiselessly towards the curtained archway. Hedley Simons was lying a little on his right side with his head back and his left arm thrown up over it. "Yes, it would be quite safe," ran the unspoken words again. "It will be the usual verdict. Heart failure." She looked down for a moment on the dark, strong, almost grimly handsome face of a man who had inspired her so strangely with the only real love of her life. But hers was a nature whose love is very swiftly turned to hate, and she hated him now with a hate that nothing but the sacrifice of his life could quench. Again his lips opened in movement. "Gracia, gracissima." Her eyes blackened deeper, and her teeth clenched harder. She drew the stopper out of the vial with the little finger of her left hand, just as a practised chemist would do, let a couple of drops fall into the palm of her hand, quickly replaced the stopper, and then laid her hand softly over the sleeper's mouth and nose. He drew one deep breath, his eyes opened, and stared horribly at her for a moment, and a shudder ran through his frame. His jaw dropped, and he was dead. As she turned away from the bed to go back to her own room and replace the terrible poison, the curtains parted, and Jenner Halkine stood before her, fully dressed, his face death white, and his luminous eyes blazing with what seemed to her a supernatural light. For once in her life she was taken completely off guard by this utterly unexpected apparition. "Dr. Halkine!" she exclaimed in a voice which she vainly tried to keep steady. "What are you doing here? Here in my bedchamber? It is an outrage." "What have you been doing in that other chamber?" he said, in a perfectly even, passionless voice, putting his hand quickly on her forehead, bending her head back a little, and looking down into her fixed, wide-opened eyes. She struggled hard against the subtle, swiftly acting influence that was overcoming her, but it was no use. Her tongue stiffened, and the word of protest would not come. Gently, irresistibly, he forced her back into the room where her husband lay dead. "I saw you," he went on. "I saw you with the eyes which are not of the flesh, but of the spirit. Eyes to which nothing is opaque. You have killed him. A life more or less in the world does not matter, but you have killed more than him. You have destroyed more than his one life. You have destroyed for the present, at least it may be for many years, perhaps even beyond the scope of this life of mine, the hope of our great work. Without the money he promised and would have given, the greatest project ever conceived by human minds must come to nothing. For that at least you are worthy of death, and you shall die. Die as you have killed him. Give me that bottle." He took the little phial from her unresisting hand. "Now lie there beside him, for this shall be the couch of your death bridal." She employed the last remains of will force that was left to her to resist him, but the influence was already too strong upon her. It melted away under the searching fires of those terrible eyes. The hand was still upon her forehead, and as it pressed, she yielded. Then, with a quick movement of his hand, he caught hold of her limp, yielding form, and laid it on the bed beside the corpse of the man, who but a few minutes before had been her husband. As her head fell back on the pillow, he put his right hand on her forehead again for a moment, and drew it down swiftly yet softly over her face. Her eyes closed and her lips parted. "Sleep, worker of evil. You who have interrupted the progress of the good work. Sleep until the awakening of another life you shall learn the full extent of the evil that you have wrought." Her eyes closed in the hypnotic sleep which was seen to change into one which most men believe has no wakening, until the last trump calls up the sleepers from the land and sea to face the final judgment. He drew the stopper from the phial and let a couple of drops fall between her parted lips, and so she died as the man she had murdered had died a few moments before. He scattered the rest of the fluid over the thick carpet, dropped the stopper on the silken counterpane between them, closed the chilling fingers of her right hand over the phial, drew her left arm out over the dead man's breast, and, after a moment's glance of mingled hate and genuine sorrow, left the room with silent steps, and went back into the princess's room. For a few moments his eyes were everywhere. Then at last they detected the little open panel in the end of the big cabinet, and the silver box standing on the lower shelf. He looked into it, picked out a few of the bottles, and, after a little hesitation, said to himself, "No, they are of no use to me. I have other weapons even deadlier than these. I had better leave them here. They will make very convenient evidence." And so he left them there, and went back to his own room. He packed a portmanteau with just what was necessary for a journey, counted over his money, then lay down upon his bed to do a little hard thinking. He lay for nearly an hour with his closed eyes, looking mentally at the suddenly created problem from every possible point of view. Then the strain of 3 sleepless nights, and the brief but intense mental activity of that early morning told upon him at last. Not even his powers could struggle against the overwhelming desire to sleep, and his eyes closed. Again and again he opened them, and again they closed, in spite of the utmost efforts of his will, and then sleep, deep and utterly oblivious, held him fast in its invisible but unbreakable bonds. When he finally woke, it was to see Harold Enstone with 2 other men in travelling clothes, and an officer of police standing by his bedside, and hear Enstone's voice say in English, "Good heavens! And the age of miracles hasn't passed after all! That's Jenner Halkyne, the man that we thought was cremated 3 years ago. Hargreaves, tie his eyes up quick and don't let him look at you. We have had enough of his hypnotism, or whatever it is." As he spoke, Halkyne struggled up into a sitting position. "I've heard something of his hypnotism too," said Mr. Cantor, whipping out his revolver. "We have got just a bit more poison of that sort than we can do with in the States. But you just hypnotize that, and I reckon you will get a more conclusive funeral than you had last time. Now, Mr. Hargreaves." By this time Hargreaves, for want of anything better, had picked up a towel, wrapped it in 2 or 3 times around Halkyne's head, at the risk of suffocating him, tied the 2 ends tight across his face, while Enstone was saying to the officer in German, "This man, sir, is a convict escaped from an English prison. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to penal servitude for life. If it had been in France or Germany, the sentence would have been death. Perhaps you remember the famous case of Jenner Halkyne?" "Ah, yes," said the officer, straightening himself up. "Of course, I remember. It was a notable case, but I thought he escaped and was frozen to death. So police journals said, and also the English papers." "So they did," replied Harold, "but he did not die. You know who I am. Now I pledge my credit that this is the man, and I give him into your charge. Extradition will be applied for in the usual way, and if I am wrong, I will take care that you are held guiltless." "Oh, Ernstone," replied the officer, "it is quite enough. Murder has been done in this house. Murder, and perhaps suicide, too. All within the house, excepting yourself and your friends who arrived with me after the crime was committed, will be held responsible to the law till the inquiries have taken place. You will make your statement in the proper form, and you can rest assured that this man will be held until all charges against him have been cleared up." End of chapter 31.
Epilogue of a Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Mayfair Magician, a Romance of Criminal Science, by George Griffith. Epilogue. The mystery of the deaths of Hedley Seamans and his newly wedded bride, which fell like a thunderbolt upon the social world of Europe and America, to say nothing of that financial world from which one of the greatest powers had so strangely and so suddenly disappeared, was never cleared up. The newspapers of many countries naturally did their best, and worked up odds and ends of dubious and partially and wholly incorrect information into thrillingly sensational narratives, which perhaps went quite as well as the truth would have done, and there, as far as the public was concerned, the matter ended. There were certain international reasons why the inner life of the brilliant woman who had once been Princess Karanatieff should not be too closely inquired into. She was dead, and so was her newly wedded husband, and they were buried with all due ceremony in the catacombs under the foundations of Natieffberg, which had received the remains of nearly 20 of her ancestors, although this was perhaps the first time that the body of a once notorious American desperado had received such honorable sepulture. On examination of his body, the wound inflicted by Godfrey Instone's bullet was found to be there. Both Harold Instone and Mr. Cantor identified him, and the latter said with characteristic force, "Well, there is no doubt about that being what's left of Collier Banfield. But whatever the princess may have been, it seems an almighty shame to plant a low-down skunk like that alongside of her from now to the day of judgment. Still, I guess it's got to be, and that's all there is to it." There was very little difficulty about the extradition of Jenner Halkine. There were many who had cause to know him too well. And finally, to make the matter quite certain, Isa Ramal, after a brief but pregnant interview with Harold Instone and a solicitor from the Treasury, decided to escape prosecution by telling all that he knew about the extraordinary circumstances under which Halkine's apparent death had been arranged. When this interview was over, he at once went into the sanctuary of secrets, and after looking for a while at the ill-omened machine on the table, he murmured to himself, "I always told him that such a thing could work, even in the hands of the wisest, for evil and not for good. It has produced no good and produced much evil. We have not yet reached that perfection which would justify man in using such an instrument as this. It shall cease to exist, and its secrets shall die with him and with me." And that day, before sun had set, the soul searcher, the most marvelous machine that human knowledge and almost superhuman experience had ever devised, had most satisfactorily ceased to exist. As soon as his extradition was completed, Jenner Halkine, once more masked and goggled, was, in the ordinary course of things, taken back to Nethermore, the prison from which he had escaped in such extraordinary fashion. His advent was quite an event in the cold, silent world which is enclosed by prison walls. As an escaped prisoner, he had first to undergo the ordinary punishments, the starvation diet, the solitary cell, and the forfeiture of all hope of remission of his sentence. In the mental sense, this killed him, but as the event proved, one element of human nature was left alive in him. When his period of punishment was over, he was sent out to work with one of the quarry gangs, and when they got to work, his eyes, peering through the darkened glasses of his goggles, recognized in the thin, bronzed, scrubby-bearded convict beside him all that 3 years' penal servitude had left of the once sleek and well-fed man who had been his accomplice in the Instone tragedy. "Hello, Halkine." He heard a familiar yet curiously unfamiliar voice whisper between the strokes of the picks. "Back again, are you? In spite of your dying and coming to life again. But you'll have to die in real good earnest next time to get out. I got the best of it after all. Instone's paying me $1,000 a year while I'm here, and I'm to have $5,000 down when I get—" He never uttered the other word. Halkine swung his pick as high as he could above his head, and instead of striking the stones, the point of it took Bonham Denyer in the back of the neck, smashed the vertebra, and sank down deep into his lungs. As the corpse dropped, he let go the handle, walked up to the warder in charge of the party, and told him what he had done. A month later, the man who might have been one of the most brilliant scientists in the world, if his genius had only been properly directed, and if it had not been, as my friend Dr. Saunderson always maintained, warped by one of the most obscure forms of insanity, and might have added untold treasures to the stores of human knowledge, stood with the white cap over those once awe-compelling eyes of his, with the hangman's noose lying on his shoulders, and the double doors opening into the pit of death beneath his feet. He heard the chaplain read the words of the burial service. The last words he heard were, "Christ, have mercy upon us." And as the bottomless pit opened, myriads of lights flashed to and fro. Then came the darkness through which the soul of Jenner Halkine passed to its next incarnation. The end. End of Epilogue. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of A Mayfair Magician, A Romance of Criminal Science, by George Griffith.